They said Evangeline was digging her own grave. And in a way, they were right about the dimensions. 10 feet deep, 20 feet wide, and driven 30 feet into the south-facing flank of Miller's Rise. The slope was a gentle thing, an unassuming swell of grama grass and clay loam that the cattle herds of Mr. Sterling ignored on their way to the river. To the town of Promise, a grid of proud, raw lumber rectangles a mile distant, the sight of the lone girl with her shovel and wheelbarrow was a weekly amusement, a slow-motion tragedy played out under the vast, indifferent sky of 1895. They were wrong only about who the grave was for. Evangeline worked with a rhythm that defied commentary. The scrape of the spade against rock, the squeal of the ungreased barrow wheel, the soft thud of earth dumped onto a growing pile. She was 18, but the sun and the labor had baked the youth from her face, leaving behind a placid, unreadable mask of determination. Kicked from the county orphanage on her birthday with $1 and a warning about the world's indifference, she had nothing but the quarter section of undesirable hillside left to her by a husband she'd had for 6 months. Thomas had been a surveyor's assistant, a man of numbers and angles who had died of a fever before he could build the house he'd drawn on foolscap. He had, however, left her the theory. He'd taught her the math of heat. One evening, before the sickness took his breath, he'd pressed a cold stone into her palm. "The earth remembers warmth, Evie," he'd whispered, his voice raspy. "It holds it. Deeper than the frost, the ground is always the same temperature. A constant. That's where you live. Not on the earth, but in it." So she dug. She ignored the pronouncements from the porch of the general store. Mr. Sterling, whose herds covered 1,000 acres, had been the most vocal. "That girl is burrowing like a prairie dog waiting for a snake," he declared, his voice carrying easily across the dusty street. "A proper house stands tall. It shows its face to God and its back to the wind. What she's building is a tomb." His words were law to men like Abel, a clerk who aped his betters. "A tomb for her and those pathetic sheep," Abel would add, securing a nod of approval. Evangeline had 5 ewes and a ram, scrawny things with coarse wool, Thomas's only other legacy. They were scorned as much as her methods. This was cattle country. Sheep were for scavengers. She paid them no mind. At the end of each day, she would check the thermometer she'd nailed to a cedar post near the entrance of her excavation. 68 degrees. The air was cooling as September bled into October, but the earth she carved into remained constant. It was the only number that mattered. The structure took shape not with the clean lines of sawn lumber, but with the organic logic of a root system. She did not fight the earth, she partnered with it. The walls of her excavation were not sheer, but sloped gently, packed hard to prevent collapse. For reinforcement, she hauled limestone slabs from a creek bed a half-mile away, dragging them one by one on a crude traver. These she set against the deepest walls, not with mortar she didn't have, but by carefully backfilling and tamping the earth behind them until they were immovable parts of the hill itself. The town saw a girl playing with rocks. Evangeline was building a thermal battery. The interior was divided by a low, thick wall of this same stone. On the right, her living space, a raised earthen plank bed, a small hearth with a cleverly designed flue that snaked up through 20 feet of soil, and shelves carved directly into the clay walls. On the left, a larger space for the animals. The dividing wall was the core of the system. Thomas had drawn it for her. "An animal is a furnace," he'd explained. "A sheep gives off about 80 watts of heat just by being alive. 6 of them, that's like having a small stove burning all day and all night. The stone will pull that heat through and warm your side. It's slow, but it's steady." She designed 2 ventilation shafts, one low near the floor for intake of dense, cold air, and one high in the ceiling for the exhaust of warm, moist air. The shafts were narrow, baffled with stones to prevent a direct wind, and could be partially closed with plugs of sod and canvas. This was the shelter's lung system, allowing it to breathe without bleeding its precious warmth. Mr. Sterling was raising a new wing on his house that autumn. The sound of hammers echoed from town, a confident, percussive proclamation of prosperity. His house was a monument of white pine, with 2 stories, a deep porch, and glass windows shipped all the way from St. Louis. It stood on the highest point in town, a stark declaration against the horizon. One afternoon, riding the perimeter of his land, he stopped his horse on the ridge above Evangeline's work. He watched her for a long time as she guided her small flock into the gaping mouth of the hill. He saw the single milk goat she'd acquired, a scruffy creature that looked more bone than beast. He shook his head, a gesture of profound pity. "A hole in the ground for vermin," he said to his horse. Down below, Evangeline heard nothing but the soft bleating of her sheep and the gentle scrape of their hooves on the packed earth floor. She lit her lantern, and the flame stood perfectly still, a tiny, unwavering spear of light in the calm, cool darkness. The system was alive. This was the part no one in Promise could comprehend. They saw a static hole, a dugout, a cellar. They did not see the living engine she was tuning. The key was the deep bedding. She layered the animal pen with a thick mattress of straw, and as the sheep and goat added their manure and urine, she would add more straw on top. This was not laziness, it was chemistry. Deep in the layers, a slow, microbial fire was burning. The process of decomposition was exothermic, releasing a steady, reliable heat that augmented the body heat of the animals. The floor of her shelter was a compost furnace, a few degrees warmer than the surrounding earth, tirelessly converting waste into warmth. The smell was not foul, but earthy and sweet, like a forest floor in decay. The stone wall separating her from the flock became a radiator, never hot, but always temperate, a constant source of passive heat that kept the temperature on her side of the wall from ever dropping into discomfort. She could press her palm flat against it in the middle of the night and feel the life of her small herd pulsing into her home. Her larder was another part of the system. In the deepest, coldest part of the shelter, furthest from the animal pen and closest to the raw earth, she had dug a root cellar. Here, in the unwavering 50-degree chill, she stored potatoes, turnips, and carrots, buried in sand to keep them from sprouting. Smoked fish hung from cedar pegs. Jars of pickled cabbage sat in neat rows. A small barrel of salted mutton promised protein for the deepest winter. Water came from a cistern she had dug and lined with puddled clay, a technique Thomas had read about. It was fed by a shallow, stone-lined trench that caught the meager rainfall, filtering it through layers of sand and charcoal before it reached the holding tank. The entire shelter was a closed loop, a self-sustaining organism of heat, food, water, and life, all powered by the sun stored in the earth and the biology of 6 humble animals. One day in early November, Mrs. Finch, the blacksmith's quiet wife, walked the mile from town. She carried a small bundle. She stood at the entrance to Evangeline's shelter, her eyes taking in the neat stacks of firewood, the secure canvas flap that served as an outer door, the placid sheep sunning themselves near the entrance. She did not speak of graves or folly. She looked at Evangeline's hands, noting the calluses and the competence. She handed her the bundle. A bit of wool yarn was all she said. "Your hands look cold," Evangeline nodded, taking the gift. "Thank you." No other words were exchanged. But in that brief glance, a silent acknowledgement passed. Mrs. Finch saw not a burrow, but a fortress. She saw an intelligence that was alien to the proud, fragile geometry of the town. She turned and walked back, leaving Evangeline alone with the hum of her living system. The signs began in the second week of December. They were subtle, easily dismissed by men who looked at the sky only to curse the sun or pray for rain. Evangeline, who lived by the earth's rhythm, felt them as a change in pressure behind her eyes. The air grew crystalline, the light taking on a hard, brittle quality that made distant objects seem unnervingly close. The usual late autumn haze vanished, and the sky deepened to a violet blue at the zenith, even at midday. Her sheep grew restless. They stopped grazing far from the shelter's entrance, clustering together, their breath pluming in air that was not yet visibly cold. The milk goat became irritable, stamping its foot and refusing to be milked anywhere but just inside the door. Evangeline watched them, trusting their ancient intelligence over the confident pronouncements made in town. The thermometer became her scripture. The daytime highs, which had hovered in the 40s, began to drop. 41. 37. 33. The overnight lows fell further. 28. 25. 20. Then came the day the temperature did not rise above freezing at all. Mr. Sterling, holding court at the mercantile, laughed it off. Just a little cold snap to toughen up the stock, he boomed, clapping a ranch hand on the back. Separates the strong from the weak. That's the way of it, his men nodded. Their world was built on the principle of visible strength. Their cattle were large, their barns were vast, and their houses stood defiant against the plains. The idea of hiding from the weather was an admission of weakness they could not afford. Evangeline began her final preparations. She brought the entire winter's supply of hay inside, stacking it against the far wall of the animal pen, creating another layer of insulation. She double-checked the seals on her ventilation shafts, stuffing any small gaps with rags and tallow. She spent a full day chopping wood, not for heat, the animals and the earth provided that, but for cooking. She stacked it just inside the entrance, where it would stay dry. On December 20th, the wind shifted. For months it had come from the southwest, a dry, manageable thing. Now it swung around and blew from the north, a direction that promised nothing good. It was a different kind of wind, not gusty but a solid, pressing force with a razor's edge. The sky turned the color of lead, a flat, uniform sheet from horizon to horizon. She brought the animals inside for the last time. As she secured the heavy inner door, a solid plank construction she'd scavenged and reinforced, she took one last look outside. The thermometer read 12 degrees. In town, lights were on in the windows of the grand houses. She could hear the faint sound of a piano. They were celebrating the season, secure in their wooden boxes, warmed by fires that consumed wood as fast as they could feed them. They were living on the surface of the world. She was already deep inside its heart. The storm did not arrive, it materialized. One moment the world outside was grey and distinct, the next it was an incomprehensible swirl of white. The first snowflakes were not flakes at all, but tiny, hard pellets of ice that struck the canvas outer door with the sound of thrown sand. The sound of the north wind, which had been a steady moan, escalated into a liquid roar, a physical presence that seemed to have weight and texture. Evangeline was inside, in the quiet. She lit her lantern and set it on the small table. The flame did not flicker. It stood as still and straight as a soldier on parade. This was the first test. No drafts. The shelter was sealed. The sounds from the outside world became muted, filtered through tons of earth. The wind scream was a distant hum. The percussive rattle of ice against the door was a soft tapping. On her side of the stone wall, the air was cool, but not cold. She checked a second thermometer she kept near her bed. 54 degrees. The sheep were calm, their jaws working rhythmically as they chewed their cud. Their collective warmth, trapped and conserved, was performing precisely as Thomas had calculated. She could feel it radiating from the limestone, a gentle, persistent heat that had nothing to do with fire. Outside, the temperature was in free fall. She had left the other thermometer on its post, a lonely sentinel in the growing chaos. She could not see it, but she could imagine the mercury shrinking within its glass tube. 10 degrees. 5. 0. The numbers ticked downward into territory where survival was measured in minutes. In the town of Promise, the first panes of glass began to crack from the thermal stress. The wind found every gap in the plank walls, every poorly sealed window frame, every space around a chimney. It forced the warmth out and drove the cold in. Fires that had been cheerfully heating rooms now fought a losing battle against the invading chill, roaring up chimneys and sucking precious heated air out of the houses. The architecture of pride began to fail. A building that stands tall presents a broad face to the wind. A building of wood has a low thermal mass, shedding heat almost as fast as it is generated. The grand houses of promise were becoming elegant, expensive refrigerators. Evangeline put a pot of beans on her small hearth. The fire was small, needing only a few sticks of wood. The smoke drew perfectly up the flue. She sat on her bed, listening to the two distinct sounds of her world, the soft chewing of the sheep and the faint, deep hum of the blizzard raging harmlessly, impossibly, above her head. The inside thermometer held steady. 53 degrees. The heart of the storm was a solid wall of force and cold. The wind, no longer a roar, became a high-frequency shriek that vibrated through the frozen soil, a sound felt in the teeth and bones. Snow, driven with hurricane velocity, did not drift, it impacted, accumulating in dense, concrete-like masses that reshaped the landscape in minutes. Anything that stood against it was subjected to a relentless, grinding abrasion. The thermometer on the cedar post, had anyone been able to see it, would have read -20, then -30. By midnight, it was approaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature at which exposed flesh freezes in under a minute and steel becomes brittle. Inside the hill, the temperature was 52 degrees. Evangeline slept, waking only once to add a log to the cook fire. The lantern flame remained utterly, unnervingly still. In his two-story house, Mr. Sterling was awake. The cold had woken him. It was a physical entity in the room, a predator. The fire in his grand stone fireplace, which had never failed, was now a cowering thing, its heat extending no more than 3 feet into the room. Beyond that small circle, the air was a weapon. The windows were opaque, coated on the inside with an inch-thick layer of fern-like frost. He could hear the house dying around him. A loud crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from upstairs as a main beam contracted in the cold and split. The wind screeched through the walls. His wife and 2 children were huddled in their bed, buried under every blanket and coat they owned. He was a man of calculations, of cattle prices, acreage, profit and loss. For the first time, he was calculating survival. He had 2 tons of coal in the shed, but the shed was 50 yards away. An impossible distance. He had a barn full of hay and over 300 head of prize cattle, his life's work, the source of his status and his pride. He knew, with a certainty that hollowed out his stomach, that none of them were alive. Cattle, unlike sheep, could not be brought into a house. They were outside, exposed. Some might be in the barn, but a barn was just a wooden shell. It offered no real protection against this. He thought of his assets, his wealth, the very foundation of his identity, freezing and dying in the dark. The numbers were catastrophic. Then, his mind, casting about for any image of warmth, any concept of shelter, snagged on an unwelcome thought. The girl. The burrow. The grave. He had pictured her freezing first, a pathetic waif in her dirt hole. But his engineer's mind, the part of him that understood load-bearing walls and stress points, began to work against his pride. He thought of the sheer mass of the earth. He thought of insulation, of the difference between a wall of 1-inch pine and 10 feet of solid clay. He pictured her down there, under the wind, under the cold. A sickening realization dawned. The grave was the only safe place on the plains. The thought was so galling, so contrary to the entire structure of his world, that he almost laughed. He, Sterling, in his magnificent house, was freezing to death. And the girl he'd mocked, with her worthless sheep, was probably warm. The house groaned again, a deeper, more final sound. A fine powder of snow began to sift from the ceiling. The silence was the first sign. It arrived as suddenly as the storm had, a profound and ringing emptiness that felt louder than the wind had been. Evangeline woke up not to a sound, but to the lack of it. The deep hum of the blizzard was gone. The world outside the shelter was utterly still. She lay for a moment in the temperate dark, listening to the soft rustle and breathing of the animals on the other side of the wall. The air was fresh, the ventilation shafts were working. The inside thermometer read 51 degrees. She rose, lit the lantern, and its flame stood true. The second sign was a pencil-thin beam of brilliant light slanting down from the ceiling vent, cutting a sharp, bright line through the gloom and illuminating a small circle on the earthen floor. Sunday. The storm was over. She pulled on her felted wool coat and her boots, her movements economical and unhurried. The animal stirred, sensing the change. She unbarred the inner plank door and was met with a solid wall of white. The snow had packed the entire entrance tunnel, from floor to ceiling. It wasn't loose powder, it was packed as hard as sandstone by the force of the wind. For a moment, she felt a flicker of something close to fear. Then she remembered the tools and the plan. She took up her shovel. Digging out was hard, exhausting work. The snow was dense and heavy. It took her nearly 2 hours to carve a tunnel through the 10-foot drift that sealed her entrance. When her shovel finally broke through into open air, the light was blinding. She stepped outside into a new world. The landscape was gone, replaced by a rolling, sculpted desert of white under a sky of impossible blue. The air was so cold it burned to breathe, a clean, sharp pain in her lungs. Nothing moved. There was no wind. No sound of birds. No distant lowing of cattle. The silence was absolute, the silence of a world wiped clean. Her cedar post was visible, and she walked over to it, her boots sinking deep. The thermometer was encased in a shell of clear ice, but she could read the thin red line within. It stood at -42 degrees. She looked toward the town. She could see the tops of a few roofs, odd angles jutting from the snow. Mr. Sterling's grand house on the hill was a ruin, one side of its roof caved in, its porch ripped away. The proud, tall structures had been broken. The things that had stood up to the storm had been shattered by it. The thing that had hidden had endured. She felt no triumph. She felt only the cold and the immense, pressing silence. She knew what that temperature and that silence meant. She went back inside, her mind already calculating. She put on her snowshoes, the ones she'd made from bent willow and rawhide. She got a coil of rope. She looked at her small flock. They were bred for this, hardy and sure-footed. They could move through this where a horse would flounder and break a leg. She opened the pen. It was time to go to town. The journey to promise was like walking on the moon. The snow was deep, ranging from her waist to over her head, but its surface had been sintered by the wind into a hard, walkable crust in most places. Her snowshoes distributed her weight, allowing her to move across the drifts. The sheep followed, their small, sharp hooves punching through the crust, but their dense bodies and short legs allowed them to power through the drifts, creating a broken trail behind her. They were a small, steaming engine of life in the vast, frozen landscape. The town was a graveyard of ambition. Houses were buried to their eaves. Barns had collapsed into heaps of splintered lumber. The mercantile's false front had been torn off, revealing the plain building behind it like a skull with its face ripped away. There were no tracks. No smoke from any chimney. Evangeline moved with purpose, heading for the highest point, for the grandest house. Sterling's home was worse up close. The wind had peeled away the northern wall as if opening a tin can, revealing the rooms inside like a doll's house. Furniture, clothes, and memories were frozen in a tableau of destruction, crusted with ice and wind-packed snow. She circled the ruin, calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Her voice sounded small and thin in the immense silence. A weak cry answered from within. She followed the sound, clambering over a shattered porch rail. Inside, in what was once the parlor, she found them. Sterling, his wife, and their 2 small children were huddled around the last embers of a fire made from a smashed cherrywood chair. They were wrapped in a single, ice-stiffened carpet, their faces gray with cold and exhaustion. Sterling looked up at her. His face, usually ruddy with confidence and authority, was a mask of chapped skin and frost-nipped flesh. His eyes were hollowed out. All the pride had been scoured from him, frozen out. He saw her standing there, bundled and healthy, a coil of rope over her shoulder, looking not like a wraith but like a worker arriving for a job. His voice was a dry, broken rasp. Help us. It was not a command or a request. It was a plea stripped of everything but need. Evangeline did not pause. She did not say a single word about graves or follies. Her reply was practical, a statement of logistics. The sheep can break a trail. Can you walk? He nodded, a slow, pained movement. She helped them to their feet. She gave her outer coat to his wife. She led them out of the wreck of their pride and into the cold, clean, silent world. As they began the slow trek back toward the hill, she saw a movement at another house. It was Abel, the clerk, his face peering from a broken window. She called to him, and soon he and his family joined the small, shuffling procession following the sheep, a line of survivors being led away from their shattered monuments by the very creatures they had dismissed as worthless. The inside of the shelter was a shock. To the survivors, stumbling in from the blinding white and the lethal cold, the dim, 52-degree air felt as warm and welcoming as a summer afternoon. The earthy smell of the animals and the damp soil was the smell of life itself. The single, steady lantern flame was a beacon of impossible stability. They collapsed near the entrance, their bodies overwhelmed by the sudden transition from survival to safety. Evangeline moved among them with a quiet efficiency that bordered on indifference. She was not a savior performing a miracle, she was a technician managing a system. She gave them water. She ladled out hot bin soup from the pot on the hearth. She showed them where to sit, along the stone wall, where the steady warmth of the animals would slowly seep into their frozen bodies. There were 9 of them now, Sterling's family of 4, Abel's family of 3, and 2 hands from a nearby ranch who had seen her procession and staggered to join it. Her small shelter, designed for 1, was now a crowded ark. The intimacy was stark and uncomfortable. These were people who had mocked her, who had considered her less than nothing. Now they were huddled in her home, eating her food, their lives utterly dependent on the thing they had ridiculed. Sterling sat with his back against the limestone divider, his eyes closed. He did not speak. He just sat, one hand resting on the stone, feeling the slow, constant pulse of warmth. He could hear the sheep on the other side, the soft sounds of their chewing and their shifting weight. He was a cattleman, he knew livestock. He could calculate the BTUs their bodies were producing, could understand the simple, brutal genius of the design. He had built a house to impress other men. It was a statement of wealth, a performance of status. It had stood tall and it had broken. This girl had built a shelter to survive physics. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of reality. It had hidden and it had held. His wife began to weep, quiet, racking sobs of relief and trauma. Abel's children, recovering from the cold, began to squabble over a piece of bread. The small space was filled with the messy, inconvenient sounds of life. Evangeline ignored it all. She went to the goat, milked it into a tin cup, and gave the milk to Sterling's youngest child. Sterling watched her movements. He had never really looked at her before. He had seen a caricature, the orphan, the fool. Now he saw a woman whose every action was deliberate, precise, and necessary. There was no wasted motion, no sentimentality. When she finished her tasks, she sat on the edge of her bed, sharpening a tool with a whetstone. The scraping sound was methodical, calm, the sound of work that never ends. After a long silence, Sterling finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, not directed at her but at the stone wall. I built a monument. He paused, the words costing him more than any business deal ever had. You built a home. Evangeline did not look up from her work. She simply nodded, once. The acknowledgement was enough. The thaw came slowly, painfully. For a week, the survivors lived in the shelter, the rhythms of their lives governed by the milking of the goat and the rationing of the beans. Evangeline led 2 more expeditions into the town, rescuing a handful of others, including a stunned and grateful Mrs. Finch. The shelter was crowded, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and shared breath, but it was warm and it was safe. When the temperature finally climbed back to the freezing point, the world began to weep. The great melting revealed the true scale of the devastation. The town of promise was functionally gone. Half the buildings were destroyed, the other half heavily damaged. But the true loss was biological. Sterling's vast herds were gone, frozen solid in the fields, monuments of ice that would collapse into carrion with the warmth. The economic foundation of the community had been wiped out in a single night. In the aftermath, a new social order emerged, one not based on wealth or status, but on a single, brutal question: what works? The survivors, standing amidst the ruins of their proud, foolish homes, looked at the undamaged mouth of Evangeline's shelter, the only structure for 50 miles to have weathered the storm without a single crack. They looked at her healthy, living sheep, which had begun to graze on the exposed grass where the sun had melted the snow on the south-facing slopes. The proof was irrefutable. The biology was the final argument. They did not hold a ceremony. They did not make speeches or offer her a medal. The change happened more quietly, more practically than that. First Abel, then others, came to her, not with apologies, but with questions. How deep did you dig? What angle is the flue? Where did you get the limestone? Evangeline answered them in the same way she did everything, with facts. She spoke of thermal mass, of passive solar gain, of the importance of the frost line. She didn't teach them philosophy, she gave them measurements. They began to rebuild, but not as before. They did not build tall. They dug. They abandoned the grid of the old town and followed the contours of the land, finding the south-facing slopes, carving their new homes into the steadfast, forgiving earth. Sterling, having lost everything, was the most zealous convert. He worked alongside the others, his hands soft and uncalloused, digging a shelter for his family with a desperate, quiet fury. He was no longer a cattle baron. He was a man learning the math of stone and heat. The final scene of that long winter was not one of triumph. It was one of work. Evangeline stood at the entrance of her shelter, the spring sun warming her face, and looked out at the hill opposite her, where the slow, patient work of excavation had begun. Her world had not changed. She was still alone. She still had her sheep. She still had the endless list of tasks that survival demanded. She turned, picked up her shovel, and began to extend the west wall of her own shelter, planning a new room for a cold larder. The cycle was beginning again. You learn the math of heat and stone when everything else has been stripped away. You discover that the most profound truths are not spoken in pulpits or written in ledgers, but are waiting in the unwavering temperature of the deep earth. They are present in the slow, exothermic miracle of decay and the simple, furnace-like warmth of a living body. These are the constants. Everything else, pride, status, the architecture of ego, is a temporary folly, a fragile arrangement of lumber waiting for the first hard wind to reveal its weakness. You understand, then, that survival is not a matter of defiance, of standing tall against the storm. It is a matter of intelligence, of yielding, of finding the place where the storm cannot reach. You go down. You go in. You build not for the eyes of your neighbors, but for the unforgiving laws of physics. You learn to trust the quiet wisdom of animals and the deep memory of the soil. And you work. You work without audience or applause, because the work itself is the only argument that will ever matter. The grave they thought you were digging becomes the womb from which a new, wiser world is born.